Have you ever really looked at the American cover of The Man Who Sold the World album? That large, ominous building standing behind Bowie isn't just some ordinary Victorian structure. It's the administrative building of Cane Hill Mental Hospital. So why is there a mental institution on a rock album cover? The answer lies in one of music history's least discussed but most painful stories. In the late 1960s, young David Bowie spent countless nights visiting the Blake and Ruskin wards inside that building. There he would see the man who introduced him to jazz, beat poetry, Buddhism, and science fiction. His half-brother Terry Burns, 10 years older. But Terry wasn't the same anymore. A schizophrenic episode after a Cream concert had changed everything. Every time David visited him, he'd look in the mirror and ask himself, "Will I end up like him too?" And that fear seeped into his entire career. So did David Bowie really abandon Terry, or is there another truth? If this story moves you, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Terry Burns was born in 1937, Peggy Jones's child out of wedlock. In 1940s England, this meant a social stigma, a mark of shame. As soon as Terry was born, he was handed over by his mother to his grandmother, Margaret Burns. Margaret Burns was, according to many witnesses, a cold and violent woman. Terry grew up in a loveless home, an unwanted child. This trauma began opening wounds in his mind while he was still a child. Peggy Burns later married Haywood Stenton Jones, and in 1947, David Robert Jones was born. For young David, Terry was his half-brother 10 years older, almost like a father figure. But Terry's life was already getting complicated. Still, the young man had a brilliant mind, was charismatic, and had a passionate love for music. By the late 1950s, Terry was now a grown man, spending a lot of time with his little brother David. It was during this period that Terry began giving David a cultural education that would forever change his life. Terry introduced David to modern jazz. They listened to recordings by John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis together. David was only about 10 years old, but Terry was teaching him that music wasn't just entertainment, it was an art form. Terry also introduced David to Beat Generation writers. He gave him Jack Kerouac's On the Road. He showed him William S. Burroughs' experimental texts. He had him read Allen Ginsberg's poetry. These names were still part of England's underground culture at the time, not mainstream. Terry talked to David about Buddhism. He explained Eastern philosophy, meditation, different states of consciousness. He shared science fiction novels. He told stories about Tibet's mysterious culture. David absorbed every word his brother said. Terry wasn't just giving him books and music. He was giving him a completely different worldview. Years later, Bowie would say in an interview, "I got the most valuable education I could have gotten from Terry. He showed me the existence of the outside world. I saw the magic, and I caught that enthusiasm. Because of his enthusiasm, I wanted to be like him." These sentences show how critical Terry Burns' role was in creating David Bowie. If Terry hadn't existed, David Jones would probably have remained an ordinary guy working in a small music shop in Bromley. Terry made him an artist, a thinker, a dreamer. By the late 1960s, David Jones had started using the name David Bowie and was taking his first steps in his music career. He'd achieved his first big success with Space Oddity. Terry was in his late 20s, married and living in Penji. But his marriage wasn't going well, and Terry's mental state was becoming increasingly unstable. One night, probably in 1967 or 1968, Terry and David went to a concert together at Bromley Court Hotel. The group taking the stage was Cream, the legendary power trio formed by Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker. The concert was an extremely loud psychedelic rock performance by the standards of the time. The lights were flashing, guitar feedback was piercing ears, the crowd was wild. During the concert, Terry's head started spinning. The volume of the music became unbearable. David noticed his brother was panicking. He took Terry outside, led him to the street in front of the building. But what Terry was experiencing wasn't just a panic attack. Terry started telling David about the visions he was seeing. He said the ground was splitting open. He said he saw fire erupting from beneath the asphalt. He described people's faces melting, buildings spinning, the sky cracking. And then he added, "I see this all the time, David. This isn't the first time." Something broke for David Bowie that night too, because what Terry was describing was a classic symptom of schizophrenia. David knew that mental illness haunted his mother's family like a shadow. Peggy's sister Una had serious mental problems. Her other sisters, Nora and Vivienne, had also been in mental hospitals. Now Terry seemed caught by this curse too. David started getting scared, not just for Terry, but for himself. If this disease was genetic, if it was in the Burns family's blood, would his turn come next? This question would haunt him for years. After the Cream concert, Terry's condition deteriorated rapidly. His marriage collapsed. He struggled in his work life. He became increasingly paranoid, more disorganized, more lost. Doctors admitted him to Cane Hill Mental Hospital with a schizophrenia diagnosis. Cane Hill was a massive Victorian structure in the Croydon area of South London. Built in 1883, it reflected the typical mental hospital architecture of that era. High ceilings, long corridors, iron bars, cold walls. Terry stayed for years in the Blake ward and Ruskin ward. Sometimes his condition would improve and he'd come home on weekends. Sometimes it would completely worsen and he couldn't leave for months. In 1970 and 1971, David Bowie was at a critical point in his career. He'd had a hit with Space Oddity, but his follow-up albums hadn't brought commercial success. He was recording his third studio album, The Man Who Sold the World. During this period, Terry stayed for a while at David's house in Beckenham, Haddon Hall. David and his wife at the time, Angie, hosted Terry. Terry hung out with musicians, watched recording sessions, but at the same time he was battling mental illness every day. The song All the Madmen on the Man Who Sold the World album is a product of exactly this period. The lyrics clearly talk about people in mental hospitals. The lines, "Day after day they send my friends away to mansions cold and grey, to the far side of town," reflect the reality that Terry and patients like him were living. The administrative building of Cane Hill appears on the American edition cover of the album. This isn't coincidence, it's a deliberate choice. Bowie is making the place where Terry lived a part of his own art. In 1972, David Bowie created the Ziggy Stardust persona and became a worldwide superstar. He became the icon of glam rock. Tours, albums, stages, fans, everything was moving so fast. While Bowie was performing all over the world, Terry remained within Cane Hill's walls. Some of Terry's caretakers at Cane Hill, when they talked about Terry years later, described him with loving words. He was a gentle man, a patient who caused no problems, they said. He'd walk around the wards, singing, talking about his famous brother. But the truth is, Terry's condition never really improved. The drugs stabilized him, but didn't cure the disease. In the mid-1970s, Terry stopped taking his medication. His condition deteriorated dramatically. He became a completely permanent inpatient. Right at this time, David Bowie was entering perhaps the darkest period of his life. In 1975 and 1976, he was living in Los Angeles and cocaine addiction was nearly killing him. He recorded the Station to Station album, but had almost no memory of this process because he was constantly under the influence of drugs. He'd become paranoid, lost weight, looked like a ghost. During this period, one night in his Los Angeles home, David looked in the mirror and saw Terry. He saw his brother's face in his own face. Madness wasn't just Terry's problem anymore. It was knocking on David's door. Cocaine wasn't just a substance he used for fun anymore. It was starting to take over his mind. In 1976, Bowie made his decision. He would escape Los Angeles. He went to Berlin with Iggy Pop. There he tried to kick drugs. He recorded the La, Heroes, Lodger albums. He rebuilt himself. But Terry was still at Cane Hill. Years later, some biographers accused David Bowie of abandoning Terry. He forgot his brother in the mental hospital, they said. But the truth is much more complex than that. Yes, David didn't regularly visit Terry, especially after the mid-1970s visits decreased nearly to zero. But there were reasons for this. First, David's worldwide tours, recording sessions, constantly being on the road. Second, and perhaps more importantly, David's need to stay away from Terry for his own mental health. Bowie's Aunt Pat said in an interview, David was afraid to visit Terry because he was starting to see madness in himself. This sentence sums up everything. When David was with Terry, he saw his own future, and this was an unbearable psychological burden. But David never completely abandoned Terry. A former nurse at Cane Hill remembered David sending Terry postcards from abroad. When these postcards went up for sale on eBay years later, their content was seen to be very personal and loving. In 1982, a critical incident occurred. Terry jumped from a Cane Hill window. It was a suicide attempt. 2 arms and a leg were broken. As soon as David got the news, he flew to London. He visited Terry at Mayday Hospital. He brought him gifts, a stereo, albums, cigarettes. They sat and talked together. That visit was David and Terry's last truly meaningful reunion. The winter of 1985 was harsh in England. In mid-January it was snowing. Cold weather had covered the entire country. Cane Hill Mental Hospital was short-staffed. Because of the snowstorm, some workers hadn't been able to come to work. Security, normally tight, had loosened that day. When Terry Burns woke up that morning, he'd made a decision. He was now 47 years old. He'd spent the last 30 years of his life in mental hospitals. 2 years ago, he'd tried to commit suicide, but hadn't succeeded. This time he would succeed. No one knows exactly how Terry got out of the hospital, but he got out. He started walking in the snow. It was about a mile from Cane Hill to Coulsdon South train station. Terry walked that distance. When he reached the station, he approached the tracks, but he didn't jump in front of the trains. He lay down on the tracks. His face was looking away from the train. He waited for the express train to London. When the train came, Terry Burns was gone. The news reached David in Los Angeles. He was working in the studio with Nile Rodgers at the time. When the phone rang, the music stopped. David picked up the phone, listened, didn't say anything, hung up the phone, left the studio. Terry's funeral was held a few days later, a small, quiet ceremony. David wasn't there. He didn't even fly to London. He didn't attend the funeral. For years people debated this. How can you not go to your own brother's funeral, they said. But David's close associates gave a different explanation. If David had gone there, it would have become a media circus. Cameras, journalists, fans. Terry's funeral would have turned into a David Bowie show. David didn't want to allow that. Instead, David sent a basket of flowers. On the card attached to the basket was a quote from the film Blade Runner. "You've seen things we could never imagine, but all these moments will be lost, like tears in rain." David Bowie may not have gone to Terry's funeral, but he never forgot him in his music. Throughout his career, there are many songs that reference Terry, written for him, reflecting his pain. All the Madmen, this song on the Man Who Sold the World album from 1970, directly tells about the mental hospital experience. "I'd rather stay with all the madmen," Bowie says, as if Terry's world was more meaningful than the outside world. In the song "Oh You Pretty Things," there's the image of a crack in the sky. This is a direct reference to the vision Terry had at that Cream concert. Even the name of the Aladdin Sane album is a play on words, Aladdin Sane. This album is the product of a period when Bowie was pushing his mental limits, confronting his fear of losing identity. But the most affecting one is the 1993 song Jump, They Say. 8 years after Terry's death, Bowie finally wrote a song directly about his brother's suicide. The song's title refers to Terry jumping from the Cane Hill window. The video shows a businessman being manipulated by his colleagues and forced to commit suicide. The lyrics go, "They say jump, you take your own life with your own hands." Here Bowie sees Terry's suicide as a result of society, the system, maybe even his own neglect. When Bowie wrote this song, he was already in his 50s. He'd matured, gotten married, had a daughter, but Terry's pain was still inside him. Here's the final question, the most important question. If Terry Burns hadn't existed, would David Bowie exist? The answer is probably no. Terry didn't just give David musical taste, he gave him a worldview. He showed that being different, pushing boundaries, changing identity was possible. From beat poets he taught that words can be weapons. From jazz he taught that music isn't just entertainment, it's a transcendent experience. From Buddhism he taught that the self is an illusion. All these ideas came from Terry, and David took them, internalized them, and transformed them into rock and roll history's most radical, most influential career. But Terry paid the price. He couldn't see David's bright future. He only lived his own dark present. A ghost walking the corridors of the mental hospital, singing, asking nurses for cigarettes, talking about his famous brother, but never really being part of that famous brother's life. And David lived his life with the fear, will I become like Terry too? Every persona change, every mask, every character was perhaps an escape from this fear. In conclusion, Terry Burns's story is one of music history's most tragic but also most important stories. He's the invisible man, the unnoted hero, the forgotten genius. When David Bowie took the stage, he was the one receiving the applause, but every movement on stage, every song, every idea came from Terry. Terry's story teaches us this. Behind great art, there is usually great pain, and sometimes that pain doesn't belong to the artist himself, but to someone else. Terry suffered so David could create. Terry was lost so David could be found. Terry died so David could live. Is this fair? Of course not, but art has never been fair. When we think of David Bowie today, we see Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, the Thin White Duke. But maybe sometimes we should stop and remember Terry Burns too, because Terry is in all those characters. Terry's face beneath every makeup, Terry's pain in every song, Terry's spirit in every performance. On January 16, 1985, the man lying on those train tracks wasn't just Terry Burns, he was half of David Bowie. That day, David didn't lose a brother, he lost a part of himself, and that loss followed him until he died. Now both are dead, Terry in 1985, David in 2016. But the music remains, the songs remain, the stories remain, and maybe now, somewhere, two brothers are together. Terry finally tells David what happened. David finally says, I'm sorry. And maybe, just maybe, Terry smiles and says, I understood everything all along, because in the end, Terry wasn't just a victim, he was the secret architect of the David Bowie legend.